Rosemary's Baby. Directed by Roman Polanski and based on the novel by Ira Levin, Rosemary's Baby was released in 1968 and is considered one of the foundational cult-themed horror films. Set in New York City, it follows Rosemary Woodhouse, a young woman who moved with her husband into the Bramford, an upscale but notorious apartment building with a dark history. Soon after, she becomes pregnant, but her neighbors and even her husband begin acting strangely, making her suspect that she's at the center of something far more sinister than a simple pregnancy. The film's tension comes from its slow burn approach. There are no overt supernatural moments for much of its runtime. Instead, paranoia builds through the behavior of those around Rosemary, particularly the elderly couple next door, whose seemingly overbearing concern hides a darker involvement. The truth unravels gradually. Rosemary's Baby is intended to be the offspring of a satanic cult, conceived through ritual rather than chance. Rosemary's Baby was both a commercial and critical success, earning over $30 million worldwide against a $3.2 million budget, and winning Ruth Gordon an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. Its impact on the horror genre is lasting, as it helped shift supernatural horror away from haunted houses and monsters toward psychological fear and human conspiracies. The ambiguity of what Rosemary sees and experiences cemented its reputation as a landmark in horror, and a blueprint for films about hidden cults operating within everyday life. The Wicker Man. Directed by Robin Hardy and released in 1973, The Wicker Man is widely regarded as a cornerstone of British folk and cult horror. The story follows Sergeant Neil Howie, a devout Christian police officer who travels to the remote island of Summerisle to investigate the disappearance of a young girl. Once there, he encounters a pagan community whose customs and beliefs clash with his own, and whose friendliness hides a disturbing purpose. The film's horror builds through contrast rather than traditional scares. The bright pastoral setting and the villagers' cheerful songs mask the sinister undertones of their rituals. Howie's investigation gradually reveals that the islanders practice fertility rites and animal sacrifices, all under the direction of the charismatic Lord Summerisle, played by Christopher Lee. The story culminates in one of horror's most infamous climaxes, with Howie realizing too late that he has been lured as the community's intended human sacrifice, burned alive inside a towering wicker effigy to ensure the harvest. Though modestly budgeted at around £500,000, The Wicker Man became a critical success and later a cult classic, praised for its unique blend of mystery, folk traditions, and unsettlingly cheerful atmosphere. Its influence can be seen in numerous later films, including Midsommar and Apostle, which draw on its depiction of isolated ritualistic societies. The original remains the definitive version, as the 2006 remake was poorly received and failed to capture the balance of charm and dread that made the '73 film iconic. Children of the Corn. Based on Stephen King's 1977 short story and directed by Fitz Kirsch, Children of the Corn was released in 1984 and became one of the defining cult-themed horror films of the decade. The plot centers on a young couple, Bert and Vicky, who find themselves stranded in the rural town of Gatlin, Nebraska. There, they discover the town's children, led by a fanatical boy preacher named Isaac, have murdered all the adults under the influence of a deity they called He Who Walks Behind the Rose. The film leans heavily on atmosphere rather than constant action. The empty streets, vast cornfields, and the children's unwavering devotion to their unseen god create a sense of isolation and inevitability. Isaac's enforcer, the older and more physically imposing Malachi, becomes the face of violence, while the supernatural element remains mostly implied until the climax, where the entity's presence begins to manifest more directly. Produced on a budget of roughly $800,000, the film grossed over $14 million, leading to a franchise that would include numerous sequels, remakes, and spin-offs. While many of those later entries veered into low-budget territory, the original retained a cult following for its combination of rural dread, religious fanaticism, and supernatural menace. Its core imagery has become a lasting symbol in horror, often referenced in later films and series dealing with isolated cults. Martyrs. Directed by Pascal Laugier, Martyrs is a French-Canadian horror film released in 2008 that blends extreme violence with themes of cult-driven transcendence. It begins as a revenge story following Lucy, a young woman who escapes a childhood of abuse and torture, as she hunts down the people responsible. However, the narrative pivots sharply when Lucy and her friend Anna uncover the larger truth. A secretive organization abducts and tortures women in a ritualistic attempt to discover what lies beyond death. Unlike most cult horror, the antagonists here are not fanatical villagers or supernatural worshippers. They're methodical and clinical, treating their victims as test subjects rather than sacrifices. The goal is to push the victims into a state of martyrdom, inducing such suffering that they supposedly glimpse the afterlife. The leader of the organization, referred to as Mademoiselle, calmly explains that their experiments seek proof of what awaits beyond mortal existence. The film gained notoriety for its unrelenting brutality, particularly during its final act, where Anna endures prolonged psychological and physical torment. Critics were sharply divided. Some labeled it gratuitous, while others praised it as one of the rare horror films that uses extreme violence to explore philosophical questions rather than shock alone. Though made on a modest budget, Martyrs became a defining title in the new French extremity movement, standing apart from typical cult horror by replacing folklore and ritual with cold, structured fanaticism. Its influence can be seen in later films that explore human obsession with transcendence through suffering, but few have matched its uncompromising tone. House of the Devil. Directed by T. West and released in 2009, House of the Devil is a throwback to late 70s and early 80s horror, both in its visual style and its pacing. The film follows Samantha, a college student who accepts a babysitting job in a remote Victorian house during a lunar eclipse. The job, arranged by the mysterious Omen family, quickly becomes suspicious as there is no child to babysit. The movie's tension comes from its deliberate build-up. For much of its runtime, very little happens beyond Samantha exploring the house, answering unsettling phone calls, and noticing inconsistencies in the Omen story. The slow pace, grainy cinematography, and synth-driven score mimic the style of classic satanic panic-era horror, creating a constant sense of dread without resorting to jump scares. The final act confirms the unease as Samantha is drugged and used as part of a ritual to birth a demonic figure, with the lunar eclipse serving as the key to the cult's ceremony. The film concludes ambiguously, with Samantha surviving, but left permanently marked by the ritual. Made on a $900,000 budget, House of the Devil earned critical acclaim for its authenticity to the era it emulates, and its restraint in building tension before delivering its horror in a single intense sequence. The film is often cited as one of T. West's standout works, and is a modern example of how slow-burn storytelling can enhance cult-focused horror. The Invitation. Directed by Karen Kusama and released in 2015, The Invitation is a psychological thriller rooted in cult horror. The story follows Will, a man who attends a dinner party hosted by his ex-wife and her new partner in the Hollywood Hills. What begins as an awkward reunion gradually reveals a more sinister layer, as Will grows suspicious of the host's intentions and the strangely serene behavior of the other guests. For much of the film, the tension is grounded in social unease rather than overt horror. Will's paranoia could be justified, or a symptom of his unresolved grief over the death of his son. Kusama uses this uncertainty to keep the audience on edge, with subtle cues like locked doors, unexplained absences, and the unnerving calmness of certain guests hinting at something more. The final act removes the ambiguity. The dinner party is revealed to be part of a mass ritual orchestrated by a cult, one of the many simultaneous ceremonies occurring across Los Angeles. The hosts attempt to kill the guests as part of a belief system centered on transcending earthly pain. The chilling final shot shows red lanterns lit across the hills, signaling that countless other homes are engaging in the same ritual that night. Made on a $1 million budget, The Invitation was praised for its patient build-up, its exploration of grief and trust, and its ability to deliver a large-scale sense of dread in its closing moments without relying on traditional horror tropes. Its controlled pace and sudden escalation into cult violence have made it a frequent recommendation among modern psychological and cult horror fans. Baskin. Directed by Can Evrenol and released in 2015, Baskin is a Turkish horror film that combines surrealist imagery with cult horror and elements of the grotesque. The story begins with a group of police officers responding to a call at an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. Upon arrival, they find themselves trapped in what appears to be a gateway to a hellish dimension, ruled by a group of fanatical cultists and a deformed messianic leader known as the Father. The film moves away from traditional narrative structure as it progresses. Reality begins to fold in on itself, blurring whether the officers are still alive, dreaming, or trapped in a cyclical nightmare. Ritualistic violence dominates much of the second half, with the cult engaging in acts that feel both ceremonial and sadistic, often shown in vivid and disturbing detail. Baskin was produced on a small budget, but drew international attention for its extreme imagery and willingness to embrace surreal, dreamlike horror, rather than traditional plot-driven scares. Its visual style is heavily inspired by Italian horror of the 70s and directors like Clive Barker, particularly in its use of practical effects and disturbing creature designs. While critics were divided on its fragmented narrative, Baskin developed a following among fans of experimental and extreme horror. The film's use of a cult not as a coherent organization, but as a bridge to a surreal nightmare world, sets it apart from most cult-focused horror, which usually grounds its rituals in earthly motives. Here, the cult feels more like a symptom of a deeper otherworldly malevolence. Hereditary. Directed by Ari Aster and released in 2018, Hereditary combines a family drama with the slow reveal of a cult manipulating events from the shadows. The story follows Annie Graham, a miniature artist grappling with the death of her secretive mother. As stranger and increasingly violent events unfold, Annie uncovers that her family has been targeted for generations by a coven dedicated to summoning the Demon King Payman. The film begins as a study of grief and familial trauma. Much of its first half focuses on the strained relationship between Annie, her husband, and her children, with unsettling events like her daughter Charlie's fixation on clicking sounds and disturbing drawings, hinting at something larger at work. As the story progresses, it becomes clear that Annie's mother was a central figure in the cult, orchestrating her descendants as vessels for Payman's eventual incarnation. The horror escalates in its final act. The family home becomes a ritual site, with nude cult members appearing throughout the property as Annie's son Peter is forced into becoming Payman's new host. The closing sequence, depicting Peter being crowned as the demon's vessel while the cult chants around him, solidifies the film's blend of psychological and supernatural dread. Produced for around $10 million, Hereditary grossed over $80 million worldwide and became one of the most talked about horror films of the decade. It was praised for its performances, particularly Toni Collette's, and for how it layered the cult storyline beneath themes of inherited trauma, making the supernatural elements feel both shocking and inevitable by the conclusion. Directed by Gareth Evans and released on Netflix in 2018, Apostle blends period drama with folk and cult horror. The story follows Thomas Richardson, a former missionary who infiltrates a remote island community to rescue his sister who has been kidnapped for ransom by a religious cult led by the charismatic Prophet Malcolm. At first, the cult appears to be a separatist Christian sect, surviving off the land and worshipping under Malcolm's strict leadership. As Thomas delves deeper, he uncovers a darker truth. The cult draws its power from a supernatural entity, a goddess-like figure imprisoned beneath the island. Malcolm and his followers have been exploiting this being by feeding her blood sacrifices, believing she blesses their crops and sustains their community. The film shifts from grounded tension to overtly supernatural horror in its second half. The cult fractures as rival leaders vie for control, leading to escalating violence, ritual sacrifices, and encounters with both the imprisoned deity and her terrifying servant, the Grinder, a mutilated enforcer. The climax sees Thomas embracing the island's supernatural forces, suggesting a cycle of sacrifice and control will continue beyond Malcolm's downfall. With a budget of around $5 million, Apostle was praised for its atmospheric cinematography, brutal practical effects, and the way it gradually transitions from a tense infiltration story to full-on occult nightmare. The film's mix of human corruption and otherworldly power places it alongside the Wicker Man and Midsommar as one of the more ambitious modern cult horror entries. Midsommar. Directed by Ari Aster and released in 2019, Midsommar follows a group of American students who travel to rural Sweden to attend a once-every-90 years Midsummer festival hosted by a secluded pagan community known as the Harga. At the center of the story is Dani, a young woman reeling from a personal tragedy, whose grief makes her increasingly vulnerable to the group's influence as the festivities grow darker and more ritualistic. The film's unsettling tone comes from its contrast of setting and subject. The story unfolds almost entirely in bright daylight, with the Harga pastoral village appearing idyllic and peaceful. Beneath the surface, however, their customs involve ritual suicides, human sacrifices, and drug-induced ceremonies aimed at maintaining harmony with their beliefs and cycles. As the visitors begin disappearing, it becomes clear they've been marked as part of the community's rites all along. By the film's end, Dani has lost her companions but finds herself embraced by the Harga, crowned as their May Queen while she watches her boyfriend burned alive in a sacrificial temple. Her final smile suggests she has either succumbed to the cult's allure or found solace in its acceptance after her personal loss. Produced for $9 million and grossing over $48 million worldwide, Midsommar received acclaim for its striking cinematography, Florence Pugh's performance, and its ability to merge folk horror with a study of grief and codependence. Its bright open visuals and slow escalation have made it one of the most distinct cult horror films of the last decade, often compared to The Wicker Man for its depiction of a seemingly serene but deadly community. The Other Lamb. Directed by Malgorzata Zumowska and released in 2019, The Other Lamb is a slow-burning psychological and cult-driven horror film. The story centers on Sela, a young girl who was grown up entirely within an isolated cult led by a single man known as the Shepherd. The Shepherd presides over an all-female following, dividing his adherents into wives and daughters, grooming the younger girls to eventually become part of the older group as they mature. The film tracks Sela's gradual realization of the cult's oppressive and manipulative nature. As she begins experiencing strange visions and questioning the Shepherd's divine authority, cracks form in the world she's been conditioned to obey. The story culminates in Sela openly defying the cult leader and assuming a position of power herself, though whether she is freeing the group or continuing the cycle of control is left ambiguous. Visually, the film relies on natural landscapes and muted tones to convey isolation and tension. There's little overt violence until the final act, with most of the unease coming from the atmosphere of control, the rituals, and the Shepherd's soft-spoken dominance. The Other Lamb was produced as an Irish-Belgian co-production and gained recognition on the festival circuit, including its premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival. Its restrained approach and allegorical style set it apart from more overtly graphic cult horror, favoring psychological tension and symbolism over spectacle. That closes out part 1 of our dive into cult horror, a corner of the genre, built as much on tension and slow reveal as it is on ritual and fear. If you're looking for a place to start, Rosemary's Baby is essential viewing. It's the film that defined modern occult paranoia and still holds up decades later. For something more recent and visually striking, Midsommar captures the same sense of dread in a completely different setting, trading shadows for endless daylight without losing any of the tension. If you've been enjoying the series, like the video, share your favorite cult horror entry in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss part 2, where we'll be uncovering more of the most unnerving cult-driven films ever made. The Shrine. This Canadian horror opens with a missing persons investigation and evolves into one of the most underrated cult horror films of the 2010s. Directed by John Knotts, The Shrine follows a group of American journalists who travel to a remote village in Poland to investigate the disappearance of a tourist. What begins as a typical investigation quickly veers into something far more sinister. The crew stumbles upon a strange unmoving fog in the woods near the village and a statue with grotesque demonic features. The villagers are tight-lipped, deeply suspicious, and clearly hiding something. The deeper the crew digs, the more violent the locals become, and when they witness a brutal ritual sacrifice, it becomes clear this isn't just about cultural secrecy, it's about something ancient and malevolent. What makes the Shrine unique is its language barrier. For most of the film, the villagers speak only Polish with no subtitles. This puts the audience in the same disoriented position as the protagonists, heightening tension and confusion. That lack of understanding becomes a core part of the horror. There's also a smart twist. What appears to be a demonic cult at first is eventually revealed to be a group fighting to contain a very real supernatural evil. It flips expectations and adds moral ambiguity that lingers after the credits roll. The final act is brutal, fast-paced, and steeped in practical gore effects, delivering a payoff that feels earned. The Seventh Day. Directed by Justin P. Lang, The Seventh Day combines the structure of a buddy cop story with a chilling dive into demonic horror. A seasoned exorcist teams up with a young priest to tackle a troubling case of possession. As they dig deeper, the true threat reveals itself, and things spiral far beyond a simple haunting. The film builds tension through tight dialogue, creeping dread, and strong performances. Guy Pearce brings grit and experience to the role of the jaded veteran, while Vadir Derbez plays the nervous newcomer with a believable mix of fear and doubt. Their dynamic drives the story forward as the lines between faith, trust, and danger start to blur. This isn't another recycled exorcism flick. Instead of leaning on cheap scares, it explores how evil can manipulate belief itself. Twists unfold gradually, pushing both characters to contort their own doubts and weaknesses. Although it didn't get much attention in mainstream theaters, The Seventh Day earned praise among horror fans for its darker themes and unexpected turns. It's the kind of slow-burn demonic thriller that rewards viewers who enjoy suspense, mystery, and stories that dig a little deeper into moral uncertainty. The Omen. Directed by Richard Donner, The Omen was released in 1976 and quickly solidified its place as a cornerstone of demonic horror. With its polished cinematography, unnerving musical score, and a screenplay dripping with apocalyptic tension, the film tapped into cultural fears of the supernatural and religious prophecy. The story revolves around Robert Thorne, an American diplomat who secretly adopts a child after his own is stillborn. That child, Damien, begins to display chilling behaviors as those around him meet bizarre, often gruesome fates. Rather than rely on overt shocks, The Omen leans heavily into atmosphere. Each death feels like it's been orchestrated by something far beyond human influence. The film's use of subtle foreshadowing, like Damien's fear of churches or the cryptic warnings of a crazed priest, slowly tighten the noose around the viewer's nerves. But what truly set the film apart was its treatment of religious themes. The suggestion that the Antichrist could be raised in plain sight, with the highest echelons of political power, was terrifying in a way that felt plausible. The idea that evil doesn't always arrive with flames and horns, but instead wears a suit and ties its shoes like everyone else, was part of what made Damien so chilling. Jerry Goldsmith's Oscar-winning scene, with its Latin choral arrangement, elevated the dread tenfold, transforming ordinary moments into scenes soaked in menace. Over time, The Omen became more than a horror film. It turned into a symbol of quiet, creeping apocalypse. To this day, it remains a key influence on films about the Antichrist and religious horror, and its legacy lives on through countless homages, sequels, and debates about fate versus free will. Stigmata. Directed by Rupert Wainwright, Stigmata arrived in 1999 and brought a slick modern edge to religious horror at the turn of the millennium. It tells the story of Frankie Page, a young hairdresser in Pittsburgh who begins experiencing violent, inexplicable wounds mirroring those of Christ, the Stigmata. What makes it more unnerving is that Frankie isn't religious, and yet she's being physically marked by a power she doesn't believe in. The film leans heavily into Vatican conspiracy, mysticism, and the lines blurred between divine intervention and possession. As the church investigates, a deeper layer unfolds, revealing that Frankie may be channeling lost scripture, writings that threaten the authority of organized religion. This angle adds a psychological and political twist to what would otherwise be a straight supernatural thriller. Visually, Stigmata blends surrealism and body horror. Scenes of Frankie levitating or bleeding spontaneously in public feel uncomfortably raw. Combined with a pounding soundtrack by Billy Corgan and some saturated, almost dreamlike cinematography, the film pushes a distinct late 90s aesthetic that feels aggressive and confrontational. Though it received mixed reviews at the time, Stigmata found a loyal cult following thanks to its bold exploration of forbidden texts, spiritual identity, and the idea that divine truth might not come from the pulpit, but from chaos itself. Red State. Written and directed by Kevin Smith, Red State took audiences by surprise in 2011 with its sharp turn into cult territory. Known more for his comedies, Smith crafted a gritty, unpredictable horror thriller that opens like a teen slasher and rapidly spirals into a disturbing tale of religious extremism and state violence. The plot begins with three teenage boys lured online only to find themselves captured by the Five Points Trinity Church, a radical religious sect loosely inspired by real-life groups like the Westboro Baptist Church. What follows isn't demonic possession or supernatural fear. It's the horror of unrelenting ideology and militarized response. The film's pacing is erratic by design. It shifts from horror to siege thriller in minutes, introducing John Goodman as an ATF agent caught in the middle of a deadly standoff. This tonal shift adds to the unease, blurring the line between hero and villain, justice and vengeance. What Red State does best is confront viewers with horror rooted in real-world fanaticism. There are no monsters in the dark, only people with microphones and guns, convinced that their righteousness makes them untouchable. It's that realism, more than any gore or ghost, that gives the film its staying power in the cult horror space. Kill List. Directed by Ben Wheatley, Kill List starts out like a domestic drama and slowly descends into one of the most enigmatic and unsettling cult horrors of the 2010s. Released in 2011, it tells the story of Jay, a former soldier-turned-hitman who's pulled back into contract work alongside his friend Gal after a mysterious client offers them a lucrative job. What begins as a straightforward series of assassinations turns into a surreal nightmare. Each target on the list seems increasingly strange, and the third act dives headfirst into cult territory with a shocking pagan ritual that leaves audiences scrambling for meaning. What makes Kill List stand out is its structure. It doesn't telegraph its horror early on. Instead, it builds tension through eerie silence, odd character behavior, and sudden brutal violence. The tonal shift is jarring on purpose, and by the time the cult elements are introduced, they hit with full force. The ending remains one of the most debated in modern horror. Symbolism, ambiguity, and psychological collapse all converge in the final scenes, with no clean explanation offered. It's that refusal to spoon-feed the viewer that earned Kill List its reputation as a modern cult classic. Last Shift. Directed by Anthony DeBlasi, Last Shift is a stripped-down horror experience rooted in atmosphere, tension, and psychological decay. Released in 2014, the film confines its entire narrative to a single location, a decommissioned police station awaiting final cleanup. Rookie Officer Jessica Lauren is assigned to guard the premises during its last night in operation, tasked with simply waiting for a hazmat team to retrieve some leftover evidence. But the longer she stays, the more the station begins to unravel around her. Unexplained noises, moving shadows, sudden disturbing visions. What starts as mild discomfort turns into full-blown terror as Jessica becomes aware of the building's sinister past. Years prior, a cult was arrested and held in the station, only to orchestrate a gruesome mass suicide while in custody. Their legacy lingers, and as the hours stretch on, Jessica finds herself pulled into a disturbing cycle of hallucinations, possession, and ghostly encounters that test her grip on reality. The film avoids gore in favor of dread. It leans into dim lighting, eerie silence, and tight camera angles that heighten the sense of claustrophobia. There are no elaborate effects, no sprawling plot threads, just a focused descent into madness. Last Shift didn't earn much attention at the box office, but over time, it became a staple in online horror circles. Viewers praised its minimalist approach and unnerving execution, with many considering it one of the most effective one-location horror films of the 2010s. Starry Eyes. Brought to life by directing duo Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer, Starry Eyes is a 2014 psychological body horror film that blends Hollywood ambition with cult terror. The story centers around Sarah, a struggling actress in Los Angeles who believes she's landed the role of a lifetime. But the audition process quickly turns into something darker, forcing her to make horrifying sacrifices for fame. As Sarah descends deeper into the web spun by a mysterious production company, her physical and mental state begin to unravel. The film explores how far someone will go to achieve success, and it does so with disturbing intensity. Body transformation, occult rituals, and psychological decay are key components of her journey. What makes Starry Eyes effective is how grounded it starts. It plays like a gritty drama about the hardships of pursuing a dream, then slowly mutates into full-blown horror. The transition is unsettling and purposeful, reflecting the industry's metaphorical and literal devouring of its talent. The film gained critical acclaim in the indie horror circuit and is now frequently recommended among fans of dark, character-driven horror with a cynical edge. It's especially noted for its lead performance and gruesome practical effects. Kristy. Directed by Ollie Blackburn, Kristy is a razor-sharp survival horror film that unfolds over one chilling night on a deserted college campus. The story follows Justine, a student who remains on campus during Thanksgiving break while everyone else heads home. The emptiness of the campus is unsettling on its own, but that silence is quickly shattered when she becomes the focus of a violent cult-like group. The attackers wear hooded jackets and featureless masks. They stalk her through dark hallways and empty buildings, addressing her as Kristy, a name they use for women who, in their twisted worldview, represent purity, privilege, or spiritual strength. Their message is sprawled across cryptic websites and accompanied by unsettling videos. For them, this is not a personal attack. It's a symbolic purge, one they document and broadcast to an unseen audience. The horror here doesn't come from anything supernatural. There are no ghosts, no demons, no cursed objects. Instead, the fear is born from how real it all feels. The killers are human. They use phones to coordinate, cameras to record, and digital tools to spread their ideology. That cold precision strips away any distance the viewer might feel. It becomes disturbingly close to possible. Throughout the night, Justine is forced to adapt. She learns the layout of the campus. She finds weapons. She stops running. Her transformation from hunted to hunter isn't delivered with speeches or dramatic music. It unfolds through her decisions, small ones that build to a final stand against the people who expected her to simply die quietly. Kristy never saw a major theatrical release, but it quietly grew a following through word of mouth and streaming. Audiences were drawn in by its clean cinematography, crisp pacing, and the sheer focus of its storytelling. There are no distractions, just one woman, one night, and a terrifying game she refuses to lose. Incantation. Directed by Kevin Ko, Incantation is a Taiwanese found-footage horror film that gained international attention when it premiered in 2022. Rooted in local superstition and folk horror, the film is loosely based on an actual incident involving a cult in Incantation where members believed they were possessed by deities. Ko transforms that unsettling real-world inspiration into a fictional nightmare that blends ritualistic paranoia with modern-day media. The story centers on Lee Ronan, a woman haunted by a supernatural curse she unknowingly triggered 6 years ago. After breaking a religious taboo during a visit to a remote village, she returns home with a burden that refuses to let go, one that begins to affect her young daughter, Dodo. As she tries to document her struggle and search for a cure, the footage itself becomes a cursed artifact, pulling in anyone who watches. Told through non-linear fragments, cell phone clips, interviews, and handheld shots, Incantation plays with structure and perspective. It uses the found footage format to blur reality and fiction, inviting the viewer to question what they're seeing. More disturbingly, it repeatedly breaks the fourth wall, asking audiences to participate in the film's rituals. You're told to chant blessings, memorize symbols, and unknowingly take part in the curse. It's an invasion of the safe space between viewer and screen. What elevates Incantation is how it combines traditional Asian horror with digital storytelling. The curse spreads like a virus through recorded media, echoing how misinformation, fear, and trauma ripple online. And unlike many found-footage films that rely on shaky camera work and jump scares, this one builds a creeping sense of dread that grows with each revelation. After its release on Netflix, it quickly became a global hit. Despite being filmed on a modest budget, Incantation became Taiwan's highest-grossing horror film, and was praised for its creativity, cultural grounding, and psychological depth. Marcy, May, Marlene. Directed by Sean Durkin, this 2011 psychological thriller marked Elizabeth Olsen's breakout performance and became a standout at Sundance for its quiet intensity and layered storytelling. The title itself refers to the different names the main character adopts, a reflection of her fractured identity after escaping a cult. The story centers on Martha, a young woman who has recently fled a rural cult in upstate New York. She connects with her older sister, trying to readjust to normal life, but her past isn't so easily left behind. Scenes from her new reality are interwoven with memories of her time in the cult, blurring the boundaries between then and now, truth and paranoia. Rather than relying on overt horror or violence, the film focuses on psychological damage. There's no flashy reveal, just a slow creeping sense of unease. Martha's behavior becomes more erratic, her trust in her surroundings fragile, and the viewer is left unsure whether her fears are real or imagined. The minimalist score, tight framing, and non-linear structure all work to put you in her headspace, and by the time the credits roll, there's no real closure, just a lingering discomfort that maybe escape was never truly possible. The Devil's Candy. Released in 2015 and directed by Sean Byrne, The Devil's Candy is a modern cult horror film that blends demonic possession, metal music, and parental fear into one raw and visceral package. Set in rural Texas, the story follows Jesse, a struggling painter and father, who moves into a remote house with his wife and daughter. The home is isolated and affordable, but it comes with a deeply disturbing history, one the family isn't fully aware of until things start to unravel. Jesse begins to paint obsessively, creating haunting, violent imagery that he cannot explain. At the same time, a mentally unstable man named Ray, who once lived in the house, is drawn back by sinister voices that urge him to commit murder. Ray's connection to the property and to the evil lurking behind it becomes increasingly apparent as his path starts to intersect dangerously with Jesse's family. Unlike many horror films that rely on jump scares or loud sound design, The Devil's Candy finds its strength in slow burn tension and atmosphere. The relationship between Jesse and his daughter is the emotional heart of the movie. Their bond adds real stakes to the horror, making the danger feel personal. Jesse's transformation from laid-back dad to a man consumed by darkness is both tragic and terrifying. The film's use of heavy metal music is woven into the narrative. Jesse finds comfort in the music, but it also mirrors the chaos building inside him. The soundtrack becomes a character in its own right, heightening the psychological unrest of the story. Shot with rich, warm tones and drenched in symbolic visuals, The Devil's Candy explores themes of artistic obsession, spiritual corruption, and the lengths a father will go to protect what he loves. Though it had a limited theatrical release, the film gained a devoted following in horror circles for its emotional storytelling and visually distinct style. That's the end of part 2 in our cult horror series. A few of these films really flew under the radar, so if you've been looking for something different to watch, you've got a solid list now. If you're not sure where to start, try Incantation or Kill List. Both do a great job building tension without giving too much away too soon. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this, leave a comment with your favorite from the list, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss whatever we're coming next. See you soon.